Okay, our last speaker for this session is Ben Allen from Emmanuel College, and they're going to tell us about adaptive dynamics of discriminate and indiscriminate mating.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, this has been a great workshop so far. Thank you so much to the organizers for bringing all this together. Yeah, I'm going to talk about mating strategies, and this is a new research direction for me, new topic. So I'm really interested in what people think of it. This is collaborative work with Sam Rothberg, who is at UC Boulder, University of Colorado Boulder, I should say, and Brian Lurch, who was at Chapel Hill when we started this and has now moved to UC Davis. It concerns the area of same-sex sexual behavior in animals. And this is really widespread. So here's some examples: mallards, giraffes, damselflies, bottlenose dolphins, but it's been observed in over 1,500 species. So it's really prevalent. We see it everywhere we look closely for it, pretty much. And there's likely many more examples we don't know about. And this incorporates a wide variety of different kinds of behaviors. So it can include intercourse, but also courtship rituals, pair bonding, co-parenting. All this stuff falls under the general umbrella of things we kind of usually expect opposite sexes to do, but we also observe the same sexes doing them. This is just a list of the known mammals that engage in same-sex sexual behavior. You'll see things like elk, foxes, giraffes, gorillas, humpback whales. It really spans all major animal groups. These are just the mammals, but it is also known in many other kingdoms or families as well. So a lot of evolution biologists have tried to ask, why does this evolve? It doesn't have any obvious reproductive or other fitness benefits, and they've come up with a number of different explanations for why we might see it in nature, such as maybe it's somehow a demonstration of dominance, or maybe it serves a social bonding, social cohesion function, helps to reduce conflict, could be practice for future opposite sex encounters has been proposed, could be a kind of mistaken identity going on in some cases where they don't know which sex they're mating with. So all these have been suggested and kind of debated in the literature. I started paying attention to this question with this paper in 2019 by Monk et al., which brought out some assumptions that were implicit in all these previous attempts to identify where same-sex sexual behavior comes from. And basically, they assumed that it was a problem that needed an explanation. They assume that it carries some significant cost, such that we need to explain why did they do this, despite whatever implicit cost they're kind of assuming it has. And they're also assuming that there's some evolutionary background of exclusively different sex sexual behavior, and that same-sex sexual behavior later evolved as for some specific adaptive or maladaptive reason on that background. So both of these assumptions can be questioned. And I was really inspired by this passage from their work that we aim to redefine the null hypothesis in studies of same-sex sexual behavior. Put simply, we are proposing a shift from asking why engage in same-sex sexual behavior to why not. So I thought that was really cool, and I was inspired to take up this challenge in a theoretical sense. And a few other takeaways from this Monk et al. Behavior. They noted that when sexual reproduction, at least in terms of internal fertilization, when this was first became an evolutionary innovation, which likely happened in marine invertebrates, they likely did not have the machinery to distinguish different sexes within their species. They also made the point, and this was followed up by a paper by Brian Lurch and Maria Servidillo, that the indiscriminate sexual behavior, which means mating with anyone from your species, regardless of what sex they are, can be a viable strategy if you can't reliably determine who the sexes are, which sex is opposite from you. And if we're going to have evolution of exclusively different sexual behavior, we need two things. We need the sexes to be distinguishable, and we need discrimination on the basis of the sexual cues to evolve. And both of these traits are themselves evolvable. So I'm taking this as my starting point, that we can look at evolution of how distinguishable the sexes are and whether or not animals will discriminate in choosing sex partners. So here's a model. We have two sexes. I'm calling them signalers and finders. I didn't necessarily want to use male and female. They can map on in different ways. But finders are the ones who may or may not engage in same-sex sexual behavior. And what happens is they randomly encounter each other, and signals send some signal to identify their sex. And this signal can be of varying quality. That's one of the evolvable traits. We'll call that Q. So the signaler says, hi, I'm a signaler. Maybe. Depends on the quality as how reliable that signal is. And then the finder has the role of choosing whether or not to initiate mating. And we're going to assume that if they know that the individual they are encountering is of the opposite sex, then they will always initiate mating, because mating is good for producing offspring. If they can't determine the sex of the other individual, then they'll initiate mating with a certain probability. So we'll call that probability, well, that's the probability, sorry. The probability is 1 minus D. D is what we call the discrimination strength. So this should be a 1 minus D here. So we can, for the trait combination of D and Q for the population as a whole, we can put on this two-dimensional grid here where signaler quality ranges from 0 to 1. So 0 means the two sexes are completely indistinguishable. 1 means that you'll always be able to recognize a signaler. And then for this discrimination strength, 0 means mate with anyone, regardless of whether you determine their sex. And 1 means only mate if you can identify that the other individual is a signaler, is the opposite sex from you. Okay, so we have our two traits. D is discrimination strength, Q is signaler quality. And to kind of elaborate on this kind of mating decision, so we have individuals in population are randomly encountering each other at a certain rate. So it's rate lambda over n per individual. We also allow the sex ratio to vary, and I'll talk more about that later. But so fraction S of the population are signalers, and 1 minus S are finders. So a finder may encounter an individual of either sex. If they encounter a finder, then they don't detect any signaler, and so they will mate with probability 1 minus D or otherwise not. If they encounter a signaler, then they may or may not detect the signal. If they do detect the signal, they'll definitely mate. If not, they'll make that same choice of 1 minus D versus D. Okay, so that's kind of the choice of mating. The life cycle in the model, we have a mating season of a kind of unit length. That's where they're encountering each other and deciding whether or not to mate. And we're also going to make this choice for now that signalers are high investment. They are fertilized the first time they are mated with the opposite sex, and they can only be fertilized once per season. After that, they can still mate, but no further fertilization can occur. So an opposite sex mating results in fertilization if and only if it's the first opposite sex mating of that signaler in that season. And then, so after the mating season's over, each signaler that is fertilized produces some Poisson distributed number of offspring. And it's Poisson B. B is a free parameter of each sex. So they produce, the sex ratio is equal at birth. So they produce Poisson B signalers and Poisson B finders. And we're going to use a sex-linked inheritance where each offspring inherits the trait value of the corresponding parent. So a finder inherits its finder parent's discrimination strength, and a signaler inherits its signaler parent's signaler quality. So this is much simpler to analyze than full like Mendelian genetics. Okay, so this is mating and reproduction. We also want to introduce the possibility of some costs to mating because that's an important variable. So these are going to be mortality costs. So each mating, whether it's with the same sex or not, costs some CF to finders and CS to signalers. Signalers may also pay some cost to produce whatever signal. Maybe they're like, excreting some pheromone or something that could be costly. And then this mortality is implemented where every adult survives with probability e to the minus total cost that they've accumulated in that mating season, and otherwise they die. And then after all that, we introduce some background mortality on both adults and new offspring to keep the population size constant. Okay, so there's a lot of parameters. It's a bit of a complex model. Here's a summary of the parameters. So D and Q are our two evolving traits, discrimination, strength, and signal quality. Fixed parameters include population size, encounter rate, offspring per reproduction, mating costs, signaling costs. And then the sex ratio, S, which is the fraction of signalers, that's going to vary dynamically based on the costs. Because if finders are paying higher costs, and those costs are mortality costs, the finders are going to die more, and so there's going to be less of them. Okay, and then our tool is going to be adaptive dynamics. So this has been nicely brought up in some previous talks, but adaptive dynamics is a framework to model long-term trait evolution over many rounds of mutant invasion and substitution. So the population starts out here, then maybe a signaler of different signal quality will pop up and take over the population, and then maybe a new D value will take over, and it'll wander around that two-dimensional trait space. This approach assumes that mutation is rare, doesn't happen very often, and incremental. So when it does happen, the new trait value is very close to the resident one. So we need this for the analytic approach to work out. And then we get a system of two ODEs of this form. And so both of them have rate factors at the beginning. And then there's two terms up here, the first one representing birth, second one representing survival. The primed variables are the mutant trait, and the unprimed ones are the resident trait. So this is, a mutant of signal quality Q against a background where the resident trait values are D and Q. The mutant trait is Q prime. And we take the partial derivative of the sum of these, with respect to the mutant trait, evaluated at the point where the mutant trait equals the resident trait. So this is the usual setup for adaptive dynamics. These are the actual equations, and I'm not going to get into the derivation. It was pretty complex. We had to build this up from a fully stochastic branching process model to figure out exactly what is the mutant invasion probability for each new trait. But this is what we get from that in terms of the rate factors and birth and survival function. Okay, so now we have adaptive dynamics equations. We can look at what actually happens. And we generally find dynamical pictures that look like this, where we have two different equilibria. We have down at the bottom left, indiscriminate equilibrium, where No signals are being sent, so the sexes are indistinguishable from each other. And there's no discrimination, so the finders are mating with anyone they encounter. It's easy to understand why this is stable, because there's no reason to produce a signal, which might be costly, if no one is discriminating on the basis of that signal. And there's no reason to discriminate because there's nothing to discriminate against. There's no information on which to discriminate. So indiscriminate sexual behavior is stable, generally. And also exclusively different sex behavior is also stable. So there's no reason to reduce your discrimination level if the sex is certain, right? If you can identify the sex of every individual with complete certainty, there's no reason to start having sex with same-sex individuals. And if the signalers would lower their signal quality, then they would miss some mating opportunities. So this is also, different sex behavior is also stable in most cases. And now we can start to vary some ecologically relevant parameters and say, like, what do we expect in different situations? And so the first thing we vary is the encounter rate, which is kind of like the population density. Just how many other individuals do you encounter? And this was theoretically interesting because different papers have made different predictions in terms of whether low population density would favor more same-sex behavior or less same-sex behavior. So we find in our model that if encounters are very rare, this leads to the indiscriminate equilibrium. So if it's very rare, then that becomes the only stable equilibrium. Essentially, when you're not encountering anyone very often, you don't want to miss an opportunity. You don't want to accidentally miss maybe the only opposite sex individual you'll encounter. And so it pays not to discriminate. And so that becomes the only viable equilibrium there. This whole region up here turns out to be non-viable. The population just crashes. And this actually matches some empirical observations. For example, in the deep sea squid, they don't encounter each other very often. It's also very dark. Okay. But they've been found to have sperm deposits. The males have been found to have sperm deposits on them, which suggests that they are mating with the same sex. As we increase the encounter rate, we see that the basin of attraction of indiscriminate behavior starts to shrink. Except over there on the bottom right, you see it start to expand again. And this is really, here there's so many encounters that there's, the signalers start to reduce their signal quality to avoid excess mating. Remember, they can only mate once per season, and more matings can be costly. So they actually send a lower quality signal to avoid mating too much. And that then leads to more indiscriminate behavior. Mating costs. Well, if finders pay a high cost for mating, then they'll discriminate more. If same-sex sexual behavior is costly, or if sexual behavior is costly in general, you want to do less of it. So that leads to more discrimination. We see that going from the bottom to the top, where the basin of attraction of indiscriminate behavior becomes smaller as we go down vertically. That's increasing signaler mating costs, or finder mating costs, I mean. Increasing signaler mating costs goes across from left to right, and that if they pay higher costs, then they're going to actually want to mate less, and so they reduce their signal quality, which leads tilted more towards indiscriminate behavior. Other things we played around with. Well, if signaling is costly, you get less of it, and then less discrimination, more indiscriminate behavior. That's kind of intuitive. If you have fewer finders in the population, then they become less discriminating because you're mostly encountering the opposite sex anyway. We also looked at reversing the investment roles, having the finders be high investment so they can mate only once per season. That leads to mostly the same outcomes. So yeah, we conclude that indiscriminate and discriminate sexual behavior can both persist under natural selection. They're both stable. And indiscriminate behavior is especially favored when potential mates are scarce, small encounters, and or when mating is cheap, low finder mating costs. So we should not be surprised to find instances of same-sex behavior in nature, especially under these conditions. It's a strategy to avoid missed opportunities. This is relevant to these ancestral sea urchins, the early sexual reproducers, but also to contemporary species, especially like sea squids that encounter each other very rarely and can't reliably identify each other. It does not explain things like pair bonding or things where they clearly have the capacity to identify members of the same sex and still mate. Those would require other explanations. That's it.